where a cup of coffee still waits for the one who never came back. Each morning in Wind Hollow, old Jed brewed 2 cups of coffee, one to drink and one to place, in front of the empty chair on his porch. No one had sat there for years, but his hand had never once trembled as he poured, until one market day he saw a boy, no older than 9, standing frozen on a wooden platform, arms wrapped around a newborn swaddled in a worn-out blanket. They stood like 2 quiet shadows among the red dust and murmuring crowd. Jed didn't ask their names, didn't ask a price. He simply looked for a long moment, then said softly, "I'll take them both." From that day on, the old wooden house held 2 more breaths, living quiet and warm, and none of the 3 were ever alone again. Part 1. The man who'd lived alone too long. Wind Hollow's wind didn't howl like in Montana, nor did it shriek like it did over Timber Ridge. It just sighed. Long, steady sighs, never answered. On a low hill overlooking the red dirt road stood a weathered wooden house, its back turned to the town. The shingles had faded. The west wall had gone dark from 3 rainy seasons with no one to mend it. Smoke still rose from the chimney each morning, not thick enough to call it warmth, more like an old ritual repeated simply because no one had said to stop. Jed Harper lived there, alone, no dog, no horse, no wife. His wife, Abigail, had passed 5 harvests ago, back when the fields still held white beans and the little room on the left side of the house still wore an unfinished curtain. That room had been painted lighter than the rest. There'd been a cradle by the window, under a small shelf of children's Bibles, a pair of baby wool shoes never worn, and a tiny pillow embroidered with a single letter, J. Jed had never taken that room apart. He never locked it, either. He just stopped stepping inside, sometime during the second winter after the funeral. That winter had clawed through wood and bone alike. Since then, the door stayed ajar, just enough for the wind to pass through, but never long enough for Jed to look in. Each morning before the roosters stirred, he brewed 2 cups of coffee. One sat at the end of the table, the other beside a wooden chair with a backrest, the one Abigail always used to mend clothes. He never looked at that cup and never cleared it once it cooled. The door was never locked, always left open in a land where everyone doubted everyone else. Only those who'd lost everything left the door unbarred. Jed wasn't brave. He wasn't reckless. He just wasn't sure there was anything left worth locking up. The horse barn out back was webbed in dust and spiders. The axe by the oak was still buried upright, as if someone had just set it down. And beneath the porch, a child's shoe had fallen from a basket. Jed hadn't picked it up in a long time. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't curse, didn't go to church. Some called him a cold old widower. Others said, "He's still alive, but there ain't no one home." Jed confirmed nothing. He simply moved like a shadow, kindled the fire at dawn, boiled water, set out 2 cups, sat and watched the road. When the sun crested the eastern ridge, he'd get up, circle the house, drive the fence posts back in, even the ones no one touched. Then came noon, then the same again. Not happy, not sad, just a man holding onto a lamp long out of oil, unsure whether it was the flame he couldn't let go of, or the dark he still hadn't learned to live with. Wind Hollow was a small town. Not many came or left. Since the red fever swept through last year, everything had sunk, like earth after rain. Nobody laughed loud, nobody sang. The few children left had been taken to the church, the ones nobody claimed. They were auctioned off like late-season colts. Jed hadn't been to market since Abigail's burial, not because of people, but because there was simply no reason. He had enough food, enough wind, enough silence. But still, Every morning he poured 2 cups of coffee. No one came back. And no one ever stepped in. Until one July morning he threw on his long coat, intending to stop by the blacksmith's, just to buy a few nails for the barn doors starting to rot. Just a short errand. Just wanted to hear the sound of hammer striking metal, to remember that something broken could still be mended. He didn't know that this small trip would touch a wound buried so long it had forgotten how to bleed, that it would begin to heal. Slow, quiet, and unexpected. He hadn't yet seen the barefoot boy standing atop the wooden platform in the town square dust, cradling something that had never cried. And Jed Harper, a man who'd spent years merely breathing, was about to do something he never thought he would. Again, stay. Part 2. A morning with a children's auction block. There was no roof over Wind Hollow's market square, just a wooden platform, barely waist-high, meant for selling old saddles, tired horses, and sometimes worse. That day there was no wind. Dust didn't float. It clung to every hem. The sun wasn't yet cruel, but its heat had already seared the planks red. Folks gathered, not many, and not in a rush. Everyone knew this was a special market day, what they called a humane auction, a softer name to make it sting less. But they all knew this was how you got rid of the kids no one wanted. Since last year's red fever, the church was full. The orphan lodge had burned in the spring. The town had run out of money and mercy. So they sold them. The first child brought out was a girl, brown hair, maybe 6. She trembled, clutching the hem of her tattered dress, eyes scanning the crowd for a face she knew. A trembling widow whispered, "I could use someone to light the stove." $1, 2, gavel, done. The second, a boy with a limp. No one bid, until the coffin maker muttered, "I could use a ledger boy." Gavel, done. 1 by 1, 11 children, 11 names shouted and swallowed into the dust. Then came the last. People were ready to leave. Some stood. Then the murmurs rose. A boy was pushed onto the block, no shoes, feet wrapped in grimy cloth, sweaty hair stuck to his brow. In his arms a newborn, swaddled in cloth so thin anyone nearby could see its tiny toes twitch beneath. But the boy didn't move, didn't cry, didn't plead, didn't look at anyone. Kids cry when they're scared, especially when they're taken from someone. But this boy stood still, as if he'd always stood there long before the crowd, the block, or the eyes. Someone in the crowd whispered, "What's this? 2 for 1? A woman with silver bracelets shook her head. No one wants 2 mouths, especially when one ain't good for nothing but cryin'. But the infant didn't cry. It just lay there, cheek glowing gold in the sun, breathing so softly some wondered if it still lived. The auctioneer, raspy voice, crooked hat, stepped forward. He cleared his throat. Told his name's Elliot, 9 years old. Can carry water, light fires, split wood. The baby's Noah, just a few weeks old. Still breathing, still feeding, both got lungs, both got arms, starting bid. Silence. No one moved. A man in a stained vest leaned on a post and called out, "Skip it. Nobody's buying 2. Waste of time." A few nodded. Some turned away. Others lit pipes. On the platform, Elliot stood. His eyes weren't wide, weren't scared. They were hollow. Hollow enough that if you stared too long, you might feel something in yourself slip away. The crowd thinned. The market was nearly over. The auctioneer shrugged. "Ain't no one want 2 mouths?" And then a sound. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, not rushed, not grand. But that sound alone made Elliot turn his head just a little, but it was enough. Enough for the wind to hold its breath, enough for the dust to hang still. Jed Harper stepped into the square, and the story he thought had ended that cold winter was about to begin again. On a page no one expected to be written. Part 3, The Man Who Never Meant to Stop. Jed hadn't planned to stop. He was only passing through the market for a handful of nails and a new hinge. The old one on the barn door squeaked every time the wind picked up, just enough to keep a man from sleeping deep when he lived alone. As he neared the square, he noticed the crowd. No shouting, just dust moving slowly across worn boots. No one smiled, no one cried, just lowered heads and a few who turned away. A silence thicker than air. Jed stopped. He didn't know why. His eyes fell on the wooden platform, where a boy of maybe 9 stood barefoot, his legs wrapped in gray cloth now darker with dirt. Sunlight glinted off his sweat-matted hair. In the boy's arms was a baby. No cry, no twitch. Just a limp neck tilted slightly, as if asleep, or already gone. No one in the crowd looked for more than a second, but Jed couldn't look away. He'd seen that look before, not on someone else, on himself, in mirrors, in wash basins at dawn, in the window pane when the fire in the hearth went cold. The look of someone who'd lost something, not quite dead, but no longer truly living. The look of a man who expected nothing, but still woke each morning and held tight to something he couldn't name, unsure if it was still there at all. Jed saw that look in the boy's eyes, and he stepped forward. The auctioneer squinted at him, confused. "Jed Harper?" he repeated, as if not sure he'd heard right. Jed didn't answer. He walked straight to the platform, didn't glance at the crowd, didn't acknowledge the man with the gavel, just stood there, hands loose at his sides, dust on his long coat, eyes locked on the boys. Neither blinked, neither spoke. "No one wants 2 mouths," someone muttered from behind. "We're closing up." "No bids, Harper. Go drink your coffee." Jed didn't turn. He stepped up onto the platform. One boot creaked on the old wood, like a rope pulling taut after too long. No one stopped him. No one even breathed. The boy stepped back half a pace, not in fear, but to make space. Jed looked into those ageless eyes, then down at the child wrapped in cloth. Still not a word. "Oh, what's your name?" someone called from below. Jed turned his head slightly, not to answer, but to say, "I heard." Then he spoke, low and even. "I'll take both." That was all. The auctioneer opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was something in Jed's voice, something that made all reason fall silent. A few chuckled under their breath. Someone tapped a pipe against a boot heel. But no one stepped up. No one argued. The boy, Elliot, looked at Jed, still quiet. Then, with a motion so gentle it might have gone unseen, he moved the baby toward the man. Not offering, not surrendering, sharing. Jed didn't rush to take him. He just nodded. Once, slowly, like a man accepting something larger than himself, but without the words to name it. When the 3 of them stepped down, the crowd parted. No one said farewell. No one blessed them. The wind began to rise, brushing the dust into the trail behind an old man, a quiet boy, and a baby who had not yet cried. Jed didn't look back. He just walked, boots pressing soft into dirt, firm, steady. Elliot followed behind, said nothing, but with each step he moved closer, and once they passed from view, someone near the square sighed. Hard to say who saved who. No one replied, because some questions aren't meant to be answered. Part 4. Coming home in the silence of strangers. The road from the market to Jed's house was 3 miles long, but that day it felt like years. The wagon was old. One wheel tilted so every turn groaned like brittle bones shifting in bed. The mule walked slow, head low. No one urged it. No one was in a hurry. Jed sat up front, reins held loose. Elliot rode behind, arms wrapped tight around the baby. The infant breathed gently, too soft to be heard. No one asked a name. No one looked over a shoulder, as if all three were afraid that if a single word was spoken, the silence would shatter. The sun tilted west as they climbed the hill. That side of town was dry, bare, nothing but yellow grass and a few patches of cactus, blooming faded purple. When their shadows stretched long across the ridge, Jed adjusted his hat, not for shade, just out of habit. Behind him, Elliot watched the wide, dusted back of the man, steady as a tree stump that no longer bent with wind. But something in that posture was tired, not exhausted, not weak, just tired, like someone who had carried something too long, with no one ever asking and no way to set it down. The gate came into view just as the sky began to turn. No sign, no chain, just two crossed wooden posts and a fence dulled by rain and years. Jed stepped down, opened it, returned. He didn't tell Elliot to follow, didn't say, "We're home." The boy climbed down with the baby, as if he already knew this road. Didn't glance around, didn't hesitate, just walked, slow and careful, like every stone belonged to someone else. The house was unlocked, always had been. The hinge creaked when Jed pushed it open. Not loud, but just enough to stir whatever ghosts still lived inside. Elliot paused at the threshold, didn't step in, just looked, not in fear, not doubt, as if waiting for the air itself to say, "You may." Jed removed his coat and hung it on the nail by the door. He passed through the sitting room, split some wood, lit the stove, said nothing. The fire caught slow, pale and thin, like a light no one had needed for a long time. After a while, Elliot stepped in, still holding Noah, his left arm tired now. He shifted the weight to his right. The house smelled of old ash and cold coffee. There were only a few things: a rocking chair that creaked, a cracked-edged table, a wall clock long stopped. Jed opened the door at the end of the hall, the small room, the one where Abigail's curtain had once waited to be finished. In the corner, the cradle. Dust lined the rails, blankets folded, a pillow stitched with the letter J. Thread shaky, like the hand that once sewed. It had lost its strength. Jed didn't enter. He just opened the door and stepped aside. Let Elliot choose. The boy didn't ask what room it was, didn't seek permission. He walked in, slowly, placed Noah in the cradle with both hands, as if laying down something larger than the world. The baby shifted, made a sound, slept again. No one said a word. Only the golden light poured through the crack in the door, falling on Elliot's sweat-damp hair and the frayed elbow of Jed's coat. Jed stood at the doorway a long time, watching, but never stepping in. That room had once been a broken promise. Now it had become something he didn't dare name. At last, he turned away. Elliot stayed beside the cradle, didn't move. That night, there was no supper, just a piece of dry bread, a ladle of cold well water, and the soft, flickering glow of a fire that made no sound. And in that house once built for silence, there were now 3 breaths, none of them speaking, but all of them staying. Part 5. Each carried something left unsaid. The morning arrived slower than usual. Or perhaps for those who'd long lost their grip on time, every morning came quietly, the same. The early wind barely stirred the wooden shingles above the kitchen. No birds sang. The hearth was down to its last ember. No one woke anyone. Yet all 3 rose, out of the instinct of those used to sleeping only half the night. Elliot sat on the front steps, a thin coat draped over his shoulders, arms still wrapped around Noah, The baby slept, breathing soft as wind through dry grass. Elliot didn't know how to keep a child warm. He simply held tight, sometimes lifting a tiny finger to his lips to feel for breath. Jed stood behind the doorframe, hand resting on the wood. He watched the boy through the narrow gap, not stepping out, not calling in his eyes something unspoken, the kind of recognition grown men don't name. Those who've lost too early will always recognize the look of someone who only knows how to hold on. Crew. The kitchen light came on late. Jed flipped the corn cakes with care, avoiding the edges from burning. He brewed coffee, as always, but for the first time he didn't set the second cup in its usual place on the table. Instead, he reached for a small bowl, the one his wife used to eat from in the mornings, a faded songbird still visible at the bottom. He hadn't meant to pick that one. His hand just reached for it, and he didn't switch. When Elliot came in, Jed was plating breakfast. Neither looked at the other. The boy didn't ask if the food was his, didn't touch the table right away. He stood for a moment, then quietly unwrapped Noah's old blanket and replaced it with the clean one washed the night before. His hands weren't practiced, but they were careful, like someone who'd learned not from being taught, but from watching and from loss. Jed laid a spoon on the table, a small silver one engraved with the first letter of his wife's name. A. He hadn't meant to. It was simply the one closest in the drawer. But as he set it down, his hand paused, not trembling, just slowed, as if hearing something echo from a place he thought long quiet. Elliot didn't touch the silver spoon. He reached instead for an old wooden one, worn smooth, and used it for Noah. He didn't ask about the other, didn't wonder who A was. Just remained quiet, like people who've sat beside each other long enough to know some things should stay unspoken. After breakfast, Jed sat on the porch. Before him, a yard half lit by sun, no trees, no clothesline, nothing to look at. But still he looked, as if light, given enough time, could fill something hollow in his chest. Elliot stepped out with his coat, likely to catch the sun. He didn't speak, but as he passed, he paused and set half a corn cake down on the rail. No offer, no smile, no glance. Just left it there and walked on. Jed didn't eat it right away, but by noon it was gone. Inside, Noah slept. A breeze stirred the curtain by the window. The cradle had been moved closer to the fireplace, the very spot where Jed's wife once sat, reading scripture each night. Today, it was a boy, no more than 9, sitting with his back against the wall, one hand on the cradle, eyes never leaving the child's face. No one asked Elliot why he hadn't left the room. But anyone who's ever lost someone too soon would understand. Sometimes sitting beside what remains is all a person can do. The first day passed with no stories told, no thank you, no I'm sorry, but through cautious footsteps, through the untouched silver spoon, through the extra coffee Jed brewed and the cornbread on the porch no one mentioned, something had quietly begun again. Not trust, not hope, just presence, and sometimes that's enough. Part 6. The Father Who Never Got to Be One. The sun had risen. The wind no longer carried the chill of night, just enough to rustle the dry grass along the porch. Jed split wood, his hands still strong, but every now and then he paused to rub his shoulder. That shoulder once knew how to hold someone every morning. Now it only knew axe, bark, and silence. He tied the bundle slowly, no need to rush. No one waited for hot meals anymore. No one reminded him about market days. As he passed the room at the end of the hall, the door stood half closed. There was no sound, but warmth seemed to spill quietly from inside. Jed stopped, Uncertain why, he nudged the door open. Not fully. Just enough to see what his heart wasn't ready for. Elliot sat on the floor, leaning against the old rocking chair, on his knees, a faded cloth worn at the corners folded with quiet care. He folded it slowly, the way grown men do when they want to keep something from falling apart. Sunlight fell across his shoulder, catching on his dust-dry hair. The room, once prepared for Jed's unborn child, was still filled with things meant for someone who never came. The pine cradle was still there, the rocking chair, a stuffed bear without a name, a blanket never used, a leather Bible on the shelf, still open to the page where Jed's wife had last placed her ribbon. Untouched. For years. Elliot looked up. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. He just spoke, quiet but sure. I named him Noah. No explanation, nothing more. Jed stood still. Something inside his chest tightened, not at the name, but because he realized he had never named the child he lost. His wife had only called it Bean, their little seed of hope. They had promised to pick a name once they saw the baby's face, but they never got the chance. A name begins a life. Elliot had done that, firmly, calmly, as if he knew someone had to begin again. Jed stepped forward, hand resting on the chair. He didn't ask why, Noah, didn't suggest something else, didn't tell his story. He just stood there, so the silence wouldn't break into anything less sacred. After a while, Elliot folded the cloth and placed it into a small wooden box at the bedside. He tucked the blanket around Noah, then sat on the floor watching his brother breathe. Jed stayed, eyes on both children. Maybe he had never let himself imagine what his own child would look like, how they would sleep, what color their hair might be, whether they'd like that cradle. But now, right in front of him, stood an image too real to look away from. No one cried. No one used any soft names. No arms reached out. But for the first time in a very long while, that room was inhabited. Not just occupied, but lived in. As he left, Jed closed the door softly. His finger paused on the old nameplate his wife had painted, still nailed beside the frame. Bean's room. He didn't take it down. He just touched it and walked away. That evening, he sat again on the wooden porch, eyes on the fields behind the house. One hand wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. The other rested on his thigh, gently clenched, as if trying to hold on to something quietly leaving him. Not quite pain, not quite memory, just a hollow space slowly being filled by something new, with no force, no promises, only the act of staying. Part 7. Touching a wound without speaking its name. The night passed like a quiet stream. No sound, no light. The wind wasn't cold anymore, but it wasn't warm either. Just enough to keep the fire in the hearth flickering. Not out, but not steady. Jed sat on the wooden porch, one leg resting on the railing, holding the old teapot his wife once favored. The house behind him was still, as if it too was listening to something far away. Soft footsteps approached from behind. Elliot, wrapped in a thin blanket, hair tousled, eyes wide but sleepless, sat down on the steps, not too close, not quite facing Jed. A long silence, then he spoke, not a question, not to start a conversation, more like a boy reading a memory aloud to himself. My mama used to say, if the night's too quiet, something's gonna happen come morning. Jed didn't reply, just gave a small nod. Not to agree, but to say, I hear you. Elliot went on, softly, as if the wind might scatter the words if he raised his voice. That night, someone set fire to the tent. A pause. The breeze carried the faint smell of wood smoke through the porch beams. She didn't scream, Just past Noah through the flap. Told me to run. I thought she'd be right behind me, but the fire moved faster than I knew." His voice stayed even, not shaking, but his hands were clenched tight at the hem of his blanket, knuckles pale. I looked back, but she was gone. Jed didn't ask who did it, didn't say you should have. He simply shifted closer, just a bit, and placed his rough, calloused hand on Elliot's shoulder. No squeeze, no pat, just a quiet weight, like a single anchor on a steep slope so the boy wouldn't slip too far. Elliot didn't cry, didn't look up, but he didn't pull away. They sat that way. 2 long shadows stretched across the porch floor, silent beneath the stars. Crickets chirped faintly, an owl called out in the distance, and for a moment even the wind seemed to still, as if silence itself needed room to breathe. After a while, Jed withdrew his hand. He poured more tea, then held the mug out to Elliot. He didn't say here, didn't say anything at all. Elliot took it, both hands wrapped around the warm clay cup. Maybe the tea was already cold. But what he received wasn't a drink. It was something quieter, a quiet acknowledgement. He was still here. And so was Jed. That night, no one went to bed early. No one suggested heading in. On that porch, which had seen so many winters, so many winds, sat 2 souls with no shared blood, no shared past, but between them there was no longer a distance that needed naming, only a silence, gentle enough to heal without needing to be bandaged. When dawn crept in, Jed stood and stretched. He looked toward the horizon, where the dunes rose like waves long asleep. "Wind's good today, might be right for planting beans," he said. Not to anyone in particular. Elliot nodded slightly and stood beside him. They walked back into the house, leaving behind 2 shadows that had once sat apart, but now walked together. Part 8. The first time the baby cried. That morning began like any other in Wind Hollow. The sunlight wasn't yet warm, just enough to slip through the cracked wooden planks beside the window. Jed was flipping corn cakes on the cast-iron skillet, his hands moving with the same quiet rhythm. The fire popped gently. The air held that faint smell of scorched batter and something old. Silence, the kind that had become normal. Elliot was still asleep, head resting on the table, likely after a long night on the porch with a cooled mug of tea. And Noah hadn't stirred all morning. Until a sound broke through, thin, raspy, but sharp, like a blade slicing through the hush. Noah cried, not a loud, healthy wail, but a short, broken gasp, like lungs still learning how to draw air. Jed froze. His hands that once worked atop a barn roof in a sandstorm, trembled against the skillet handle. Elliot shot upright, eyes wide, not fully awake, nearly stumbling to the cradle, as if his brother might vanish if he took 1 second too long. The crying rose again, longer, stronger. No one knew what to do. No one moved fast enough. No one spoke, but Jed turned, and slowly, steadily, he walked to the room that had once belonged to his wife, where the pine cradle had been returned to its rightful place. He opened a drawer. Inside, an old glass baby bottle, a fine crack along the rim, and a rubber nipple bought years ago, just in case. He washed them with hot water, poured warmed milk. Didn't ask Elliot, didn't need to. When he handed the bottle to Elliot, his hands no longer shook. Elliot took it, and without thinking, guided the nipple to Noah's mouth. The baby latched on, drinking fast and greedy, as if the world might take it away again. Elliot exhaled. Jed took a step back, then sat down in the chair across from them. No one said anything. No one offered thanks. But in that moment, the house had a sound. Not wind, not floorboards creaking, a sound of life. Jed watched them. Watched the bottle tilt in Elliot's hands. Watched a small trickle of milk spill from Noah's lip. And then he said, not to anyone in particular, just loud enough to be heard, every child needs a home. Or at the very least, someone who won't leave. Elliot didn't answer, but his eyes softened, not from the words themselves, but from the truth behind them, that someone had finally understood what he'd never known how to say. That morning, Jed cleaned the kitchen more thoroughly than usual. He pulled the chair closer to the hearth, poured more warm water, and placed the small silver spoon, the one his wife used to protect, like it was made of gold, into the kitchen drawer instead of hiding it away in the old wooden box. No one mentioned that Noah had cried, but from that day on, the three people in that quiet wooden house knew your baby wasn't just alive, he was asking to live. Part 9. The Man Who Came to Take Back What He'd Left Behind. That afternoon held no wind, no sunlight either, only a cold gray hue, as if the sky couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Jed was cutting thorn brush in the backyard when he heard the hoofbeats. Slow, unhurried, the kind of pace reserved for men who believe they have the right to show up. Elliot was drawing water from the well. Noah slept. The bedroom window cracked open, its curtain shifting like breath. The man dismounted like he belonged here. His eyes darted, not out of fear but assessment, dust on his coat hem, weathered boots, a stack of crumpled papers in his hand. Name's Silas, he said. I'm the boy's father. I've come to take him back. Jed said nothing, neither did Elliot. Silas continued, I've got papers. Witnesses. That boy was taken without proper say. Elliot pulled Noah close, stepped back once, then stood still, like a stone pillar guarding the cradle. Not a word. A few townsfolk had gathered. No one spoke, just stood in the distance watching a conversation they knew better than to join. Some looked at Jed, some at Silas. A few exchanged glances, a sigh, a shake of the head, but no one moved forward. Silas waved one of the papers in the air. I couldn't stay before, but now I can. I've got means. I'll provide for him. Jed met his eyes level. If you want to take him, step through me. Silas clenched the paper. A moment passed, then another, but he didn't step forward, not out of fear for Jed, not even for the child, but because no one there stood with him. The silence, thick enough to cut, was the town's final verdict. A woman in a flour-stained apron whispered near the fence, You abandon your child in a plague. You don't get to come back. An old man shook his head. That boy's chosen this place. And this house has chosen him. Silas no longer looked at anyone. He turned. Boots brushing sand. No stomping, no curse, just quiet. He mounted his horse and rode away. The sound of hooves swallowed in a cloud of dust. As night fell, Elliot still stood there, holding Noah. His face dry, no tears, no expression, but his arms clenched tight, like if he let go, the baby might dissolve into air. Jed came beside him, didn't speak, just stood. The breeze stirred, not cold, but enough to make the coat hems sway. No one spoke of what happened that day, but from that evening on, the yard was always swept clean. The front door was never left ajar, and Elliot never looked at people like someone afraid of losing what he'd found. Part 10. No need to say thank you. Just stay. That night, long after the hoofbeats had faded and the moonlight flickered across the eaves, the house fell quiet once more. No one brought up the encounter. No one said, Glad that's over, or, You should have run him off harder. No one called anyone a good man. Elliot wiped the table with a worn rag that once belonged to Jed's wife. He didn't look up, just cleaned. Long, slow strokes, then returned to his seat, waiting for Jed to stoke the fire. Jed stepped into the kitchen and poured more water into the kettle. The oil lamp flickered against the wall, casting shadows that looked like 3 figures instead of 2. For the first time in many months, Jed spoke. Not about chores, not about weather, just a memory surfacing like a cactus bloom in dry land. My wife used to light the lamp around this hour, said she was afraid of the dark arriving before she did. His voice was steady, not cracking, just remembering. Elliot looked up, nodded, said nothing more. But after that night, the lamp burned longer. Jed didn't ask Elliot to do anything, but the next morning a few logs were neatly stacked beside the stove. Noah's blanket had been aired out early, and the tiny silver spoon, once kept apart, now sat beside the other 2. No thanks were exchanged, no favors owed. But in those small acts, a quiet thread began to stitch them together. Jed sat on the porch, eyes on the field. The grass had grown tall. The dry season had set in. Noah slept. Elliot read beside him, an old book frayed at the edges once owned by Jed's wife. He read slowly, lips moving without sound. Jed never told him to read, but each time the boy opened the book, Jed stayed longer. A deer wandered past the edge of the trees. Elliot pointed. Jed nodded. Neither chased it, neither moved, because what they saw wasn't a deer, but a kind of peace they once thought they'd never find again. And then one night, Jed set an extra bowl, not out of habit, not out of duty, just because it was time. At the table, 3 bowls, 3 spoons, 3 helpings of cornbread. Not equal, not perfect, but enough. Elliot looked at it, didn't ask. He pulled out a chair, set Noah in the cradle beside them, and ate. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't need an apology. Sometimes it begins with a small nod, a chore done unasked, an extra place set, a light left burning longer than needed, and those who've once lost everything begin to stay. Part 11. A town begins to notice who stayed. Jed's old wooden house faced east, where the morning light hit the porch before Wind Hollow had even begun to stir. For years, no one stopped by. The door was always open, but no one stepped through, and no one asked why, until that morning. On the doorstep, a small cloth sack, inside, flour, a few potatoes still clinging to soil, and a coil of twine that smelled faintly of sun-dried grass. No name, no note, just a single boot print mingled with hoof marks, fading toward the main road. Jed picked it up and looked at it for a long time. He didn't go inside right away, but he didn't leave it behind either. He placed it on the table, said nothing. Half an hour later, the stove was lit, and the scent of fresh cornbread filled the house. The next day there was a jug of milk, then a neat bundle of firewood, stacked as if someone had measured each piece with care. This time it was Elliot who opened the door. He looked around. No one nearby, just a herd of horses galloping past in the distance, dust trailing behind like waves. He said nothing to Jed, just brought the wood inside and added 3 dry weeds to the pile, as if leaving a mark of his own. One day someone knocked, for the first time in many seasons. It was Miss Rose, the fabric vendor, hair silvered, a small bundle in her arms. "Got some leftover cloth," she said. "Make something for the little one." She didn't linger, didn't step inside. She placed the bundle down and turned away. Elliot picked it up, didn't open it right away, but that night he sat by the lamp, trimming fabric with a rusted pair of scissors, trying to sew a shirt that might fit Noah. Jed watched, offered no advice, but he brought out a needle, the one his wife had once used, and placed it quietly beside the plate of bread. Next came Mr. Harlan, the horseman from the west pasture. "Heard you've got yourself a new hand around the place," he said with a quiet grin, the kind of smile old Western men offer when they don't want to be caught being soft. He didn't wait for a reply, just left behind a small saddle. Perfect for a young rider. After that, every few days something new appeared. A pair of tiny leather gloves, a bundle of wild hay for goats, a tin box full of salt, old but filled to the brim. No one asked how the house was doing. No one stepped inside, but the next day they returned with more. One man outside the blacksmith shop said aloud, "I saw him stand with that child." That's when I knew. He ain't alone no more. Not everyone said things like that, but perhaps everyone thought it. Inside that house, new sounds began to rise. Elliot's footsteps running down the slope at dawn, Jed tapping lightly with a hammer, fixing the barn door, the rare, startled laugh when Noah knocked over his milk bottle, and the water splashing in the basin before meals, a quiet sound, but one long absent. Jed realized the greatest gift wasn't that they were being helped, it was that they were being noticed. And in a land where folks are used to loss, being noticed was already a way to begin again. Part 12. The first time someone said, "Pa, eh." That afternoon, the western wind rolled down from the hills, carrying with it the faint scent of burned grass from somewhere far. Jed sat under the porch, rearranging the damp firewood, still heavy from last night's rain. Elliot moved about near the goat pen, basket in hand, muttering under his breath as if working out the feed ratios. Everything felt calm, the kind of calm that folks who've lost too much rarely let themselves trust. The hanging lantern by the door had just been wiped clean. Jed was fixing the hinge, a small task, but one he hadn't touched since his wife passed. Then, from the corner of the house, Elliot called out, natural as breathing, "Pa, the wood's still wet." Jed froze. He didn't turn, didn't answer, just stood, hand still gripping the hinge he'd just tightened. Neither of them said another word. There was no sorry, no "I didn't mean to," no "that came out wrong." Just the wind slipping between the porch slats. And Jed, quietly walking into the kitchen, hand still wrapped around the hinge. That night, no one brought it up. Elliot went about his tasks. Jed lit the stove. Noah slept. His tiny fingers curled around the blanket's edge like reaching for something familiar. But the next morning, when Elliot set the table, there were 3 bowls, 3 spoons, laid out just so. No one needed to say who sat where. The front door had been mended too. No more draft slipping through the crack. The hinge turned smooth. Elliot pushed the door, surprised to find it didn't creak. He turned to look at Jed. Jed said nothing, just placed a hand on Elliot's shoulder, a pat not too hard, not too soft, just enough for Elliot to understand. He'd heard. After so many years, one short word, not begged, not planned, reached a place inside Jed that neither grief nor silence had touched. He didn't need to be called father, but when Elliot said, "Pa," Jed knew he'd been chosen, not out of need, not out of duty, but because the boy felt safe enough to say it. In a land where many children call someone Pa just to survive, and many men take them in just to quiet their own loneliness, that little word, Pa, plain, unpolished, unscripted, was the most sacred thing he'd ever been given without a signature. No one brought it up the next day. No one praised the boy. No one asked Jed how he felt. But when 3 bowls were rinsed clean and the new hinge no longer squeaked, people knew a family had begun, without ever being declared. Part 13. A quiet day that needed no reason. Summer arrived softly in Wind Hollow. Not loud like elsewhere. The wind slipped through scorched hills and past rooftops without bothering to knock. Jed rose early, as always, but now he didn't wake alone. Elliot had learned the rhythm. He tied his belt, rolled his pants, and tugged on old boots by the horsepen. Hay was bundled, chickens released early. The goats, all named, even if none ever listened, were called one by one. The house now held 3 sets of footsteps, each with its own rhythm. Jed's were slow, Elliot's ran fast, and Noah crawled across the cool stone floor, fingers reaching for slivers of light through the window. No one called it family. There was no need. Every gesture spoke. Enough. Jed no longer sat alone on the porch. He'd built another small chair, oak scraps pieced together just right, where Elliot now sat when chores were done. They didn't talk much. Sometimes they simply shared an apple, each biting from opposite sides. And when Noah cried, they both turned. One rose, the other poured milk. No one asked, no one gave orders, but it was clear they had lived together long before the paperwork of it all. Once Elliot dropped a spoon. Jed bent down to pick it up. Elliot said, "Let me." Jed still bent at A, but handed it over with both hands, as if the act meant something. It was the same way he once imagined giving things to the child that never got the chance to grow, a child that only had a name inside memory. There were no photos on the wall, no chiming clocks, only scratches on the tabletop, each one a meal passed. Only the sound of water as Elliot washed bottles, Jed's boots stacking wood, and Noah's giggles, high and sudden like the first raindrops of the season, as he reached for a sunbeam. Jed sat in his usual chair, watching the 2 boys play beneath the porch steps. A worn wooden horse rolled across the dust. Elliot pushed. Noah laughed. Dust rose soft like fog. Jed placed a hand on his knee, narrowed his eyes, and murmured, "If anyone asks why I chose them, maybe it's because they chose me first." No one heard him. No one needed to. Some truths only need one person to know them, and Jed knew. He wasn't alone anymore. Not with 2 more shadows falling alongside his every afternoon. Part 14. An end that wasn't goodbye. One late afternoon, as sunlight pulled back from the hills, like an old horse returning to the barn, Jed sat beneath the elm tree with Noah in his lap. The boy chewed on a strip of apple skin, his hair tousled from wind, a wooden spoon in hand. No one remembered where he'd picked it up. Elliot approached from the back garden, hands covered in dirt, sweat lining his shirt. He'd just planted a few seeds. What Jed had once called old squash, sweet if the ground's kind. A man from town rode by, slowed his horse, and tipped his hat. He glanced at the old cabin, at the 3 figures in the fading light, then asked, "You think you saved those kids, Jed?" Jed didn't rush an answer. His hand smoothed Noah's hair, a gesture no one taught, but he'd always remembered. He shook his head, voice dry like last season's leaves. "No. They saved me from living without ever really being alive." The man paused, then turned his horse. He didn't speak again. Jed watched him ride off, didn't thank him, didn't call out. He didn't need to, because now he no longer needed anyone to confirm whether he was right or wrong. All he needed was another morning to wake up early, to bake 3 loaves, to hear a baby cry before the sun was sure of itself, and to see Elliot drop a spoon into a cup. After supper, without either of them having to say, "Today was full." The wind kept blowing, not hard, but it carried something he hadn't heard in a long while. The creak of a door that had finally opened. the crack of dirt splitting beneath the elm, where the first sprout had pushed through, and laughter, soft and small, from a child who didn't yet know how to say his name. Inside the old wooden house, someone stayed. The lamp was lit, not out of fear of darkness, but because someone needed to see what was in their bowl. The spoon was placed where it belonged, not as a tribute to memory, but for actual use. And 3 shadows stretched across the porch floor, long in the evening light. None of them stood alone. If you've ever set a place for someone who never came back, if you've waited for someone not knowing if they'd return, if you've lived in a house filled only with wind and no one calling your name, then maybe you understand this story, not because it's special, but because it's quietly a little like you. On the days no one else noticed. If so, leave a word below. Not your story, just one word. Stay. Where no one has to be alone anymore. The wind still moves across the old wooden roof, just as it once moved through the lives of those who thought they had nothing left to hold. But sometimes just a cup of coffee placed where it's always been. A child who learns to say the right name. A grown man patient enough to stay. Asking nothing, leaving no one, is all it takes for a house to become a home again. We don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love. We only need, at some point, for someone to look at us and not look away.